Welcome to the Trust Factor Radio, bringing you interviews and insights to unlock the power of the subconscious mind to create authority, credibility, and trust. With your host, the Authority Architect and best-selling author, Neil Howe.
Hello and welcome to the show. This is your host, Neil Howe, and today my special guest is Mike Wink. He and his wife, Gigi, run the law firm of Wink & Wink, which has been helping people and small business owners get out of debt for over 10 years. Mike specializes in helping small business owners get out of debt, oftentimes while continuing to run their business. Prior to starting Wink & Wink with Gigi, Mike was CEO of a venture-backed company and also worked for a venture capital law firm. He understands the unique challenges of small business owners and has a broad base of experience in business finance and debt relief. He gives his cell phone number to his clients, and he is committed to providing personal service and objective advice to all his clients. Mike Wink, welcome to the show.
Hi, Neil. Thanks for having me.
Well, there's a lot to talk about right now. There's a lot going on. People are going to be reaching out to bankruptcy attorneys all over the country, and I know that they are going to have lots of questions that we hope to be able to answer some of them today. But give us a little bit more information about yourself and your firm. Where are you in the Denver Boulder area? Is that correct?
That's right. My wife and I started this law firm during the Great Recession. The business I was running at that time failed, and so we saw an opportunity here, and we've been doing it ever since. And pretty much Denver metro area. I actually live right outside of Boulder, but Boulder, Denver is only about 20 miles apart, so it's a fairly heavily populated area, and we've been serving folks here for just over 10 years now, and helping them get out of debt. And yeah, that's what we do.
So to date this interview, we are right in the middle of the crisis that is the Corona COVID-19. It's turning into, I think, more of a financial crisis than it will be a health crisis. How are things out there in the Denver area?
I think it's very similar to what you're experiencing out there in Atlanta and in many parts of the country. We're under shelter-in-place order here. I think I saw the weekly jobless claims just jumped to over 3 million, which you might have seen that, which kind of shatters the previous record of weekly jobless claims, which was I think around 700,000 back in the early 80s. So we're in a very I don't think there's any way to say it. We're in a terrible time for people right now, and I think it'll be very relevant for our business and what we do going forward in the coming months and even years.
Yeah, with 3 million jobless, I mean, that's a crazy number for the United States. And, I've heard President Trump saying, we were at our highest point just, 4-6 weeks ago. The stock market was at its highest, unemployment was at its lowest, and now we've got 3 million jobless already. It's really crazy what's happened so fast.
It is, and like you just said, it's like a 180-degree turn on the economy and people's way of thinking. But, from my perspective, the debt has been rising steadily since the Great Recession. And really, as the economy cycles, so does debt, leveraging, and then there's periods of deleveraging. So after the Great Recession, for example, there was a spike in bankruptcies, corporate, personal, small business, all types of bankruptcies. I think that, then they went down. But during that downtime, while people are employed and, the economy is booming, there's still a just massive expansion of debt, corporate debt, mortgage debt, credit cards, student loans, you name it. It's been building. And so I think we were going to end up with some round of increased bankruptcies in the coming years sort of independent of the coronavirus. It's just hard to know exactly what would trigger that kind of default. But obviously, this is unprecedented in how big and bad it's going to be. So I feel certain that it's going to trigger bankruptcies and debt defaults. And fortunately, bankruptcy gives people relief. It's actually, despite all the stigma with it, it's a critical component of the economy, because the economy is so much based upon debt that when we go through these cycles, bankruptcy lets us flush a lot of that out of the system, so that we can, whether you're a business or an individual or whatever, so that you can move on and restart and rebuild without being kind of prisoner to your debt.
Mm. Yeah, we've been on a wave of prosperity for quite some time now, and that there's always going to be a correction in the market. I don't think anybody saw such a large correction coming. It's been a little bit strange how this virus has really, not only here in the United States, but the rest of the world, brought many countries financially to their knees. Be interesting just to see what the recovery is globally, let alone in, our own locality as well.
Yeah. And I, it's just, again, I can't say it enough that, bankruptcy, that doesn't have necessarily the best reputation, and it's partially because no one wants to file it, no one plans to file it, no one takes out debt or very, very few people take out debt with the intention of not paying it. But the reality is that the economy is based on it, and even in good times, people are defaulting, and something like this is just going to create a massive default, and it will also push other people who are otherwise in relatively good financial position into debt. So, it's going to impact people differently. I expect that some of the weaker hands out there, for lack of a better way to say it, will be folding in the near term. But people who are in relatively decent shape are, if this goes on for months and years, savings will dwindle and debt will rise to the extent you have access to it, just as a means of getting by.
Yeah, well, I know a lot of the larger corporations might be in better standing, but you deal mainly with small businesses. How do you think it's really going to affect them in the months and well, in the immediate term and in the long term as well?
Sure. Well, fundamentally, what we're seeing in the country right now is the demand curve is bent down, and so. For a lot of these businesses and for individuals as well, it's really a game of survival. If you're, I would imagine that most small businesses out there weren't running any kind of modeling or even considering a worst case scenario that is this bad. And so one of the initial issues for people is, how do I survive? I think that, there's employee costs and letting people go. I think that most small business owners need to make those moves. I know that's very difficult to do. For a small business, typically there's personal relationships and emotion involved. But you really got to get aggressive about right-sizing, downsizing your expenses to try to make it through this. And because you got to figure that you're going to be operating at significantly reduced income or no income for, months. I guess it's hard to know exactly how long this is going to go on, but that is certainly one of the first steps. I think another one that people need to embrace, small business owners in particular need to embrace, is communicating with creditors, landlords, vendors. If you can't pay them, I think a lot of small business owners tend to get ashamed and maybe a little sheepish by the situation. But my experience is that you're going to do a lot better by communicating with these creditors and letting them know what's going on. I think if there is something good in this terrible time, it's that I think the vendors, the landlords, everybody kind of recognizes that this is exceptional. So to the extent you're ever going to get any forbearance or any help from a creditor, I got to think now is about as likely a time as ever.
Yeah, and there is an understanding there. Certainly with the bigger companies, there's an understanding. But like you said, there's an emotional aspect to this where you want to do the best that you can, but you've also as a business, you've got to look at the bottom line and fiscally what is the best for your business, whether you have investors or whether you're a small business and you're just trying to do what's best for your family. You know, how our businesses are going to be able to handle the emotional and the financial responsibility.
Well, like I said, on the emotional side is significant, and I suspect that many will do damage to themselves financially. Many small business owners will do damage to themselves financially trying to hold on to, employees and certain things. And I would encourage, folks to make moves swiftly if they can, and try to set the emotions aside. And of course, it all depends on what business you're in and what your demand looks like and what you can produce during this time. Certainly, if you can keep people employed and make the kind of money to justify it, that's great. But I think you've got to really work hard to put emotion aside. And I know, having run a business that went down in the Great Recession, how hard that is. I went to bed for months, every night, struggling with how am I going to make it work, and then waking up every day, committed to making it work. And that emotional cycle is brutal. And I expect that people are going to they're starting to go through it now, and it's even harder, right, by the fact that the economy was just so good, right? So it's hard to shift your thinking that quickly, but you really have to, if you're going to have, I think, any chance of coming out of this with any, with your business intact and in your livelihood.
Mm. Yeah, it's definitely a tough position to be in. There's a lot of stress that is, around the finances, especially now. How do you think the stimulus is going to help small businesses? What's available to them? And, what kind of timeline do you think we're looking at? Of course, everything is uncertain still.
Right. So, I guess it just got approved today in the Congress. So I'm not totally on top of everything that's in there. I understand people are going to be getting some checks, and certain industries are going to be getting a lot of money, and there will be some small business SBA type loans that could potentially turn into grants. So unfortunately, on this call, Neil, I'm not really ready to kind of say exactly what that means in terms of SBA lending. But I think it's if you're out there and you're struggling as a small business owner, is something that you need to look at. And we're going to be spending time in the next week or so. I think it even has some impact on bankruptcies in Chapter 13. So we're going to take some time to make sure we understand it so we can guide people that way. Normally I'm not a big fan of taking on debt to pay debt. But at this time, if there's an opportunity to do that, and the SBA is offering you the loan, and there's a way to turn that loan into a grant, this could be an opportunity. And frankly, it is an opportunity for people to get out of debt. The reality is that these crises, when incomes are down and asset values are down, those are the best times to deleverage. bankruptcy tends to be cheapest for people at that time, because bankruptcy is fundamentally a legal bargain to get out of debt that can cost you based on your ability to repay. So if your income is lower, if you're a small business owner, your income's lower, your asset values are lower, you can take advantage of the opportunity to get of the market conditions to get out of debt. And to relate it back to what your question was, though, with the stimulus, I mean, my sense is that there will be some stuff in there from the SBA. How readily, how quickly people can get at it, and what types of business can get at it, I don't know. The truth is, I'm more helping people get out of debt, and occasionally I help them, direct them to places where they can refinance and find debt. But really, I'm on the other side of the spectrum.
Mm. So, with this aside, obviously this is front and center of what's happening now, but, for a business that, before this all went down, what are some of the things that generally gets a business into trouble to where they might need your services to help them out in bankruptcy?
Yeah, well, there's a few things. I think that one of the biggest things I see is that when people buy small businesses, they very regularly overpay for them. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but I've represented so many small business owners that are carrying debt from the purchase of the business. The SBA often can give you that debt. Sometimes the prior owner of the business is carrying that debt. But my experience is that for whatever reason, people are often overpaying for the businesses when they buy them. I think another common mistake is, retail leases. To the extent you're in a retail business, retail leases have been very onerous. And this despite the fact that we have a ton of retail space, empty retail space in this country, but the landlords and those leases tend to be really expensive and long-term. And if your business fails or is struggling, a lot of times your biggest debt is, 3 years left on a lease at $5-10 grand a month. That alone could force someone to file bankruptcy if the business fails.
Right, yeah, and retail is getting hit really hard right now with malls and shopping centers being closed down. It's going to be hard for them to get back. But, with many industries right now, technology has kind of come to the rescue. Do you think that's going to hurt specifically something like retail in the future once, we come back to recovery?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has been hurting it, and it will continue to. But at the same time, the people will have opportunities in retail. But I suspect that we'll see some fundamental transformations, right, from this downturn, right? I mean, like, people have been working from home increasingly. I think now, that's going to spike. Online learning is another area where, it's had so much promise and been talked about and I guess implemented on some levels. But, those kinds of businesses that are enabling that are seeing, from what I'm hearing, tenfold increase in business in just this past, few weeks alone. So I suspect that as people embrace that kind of stuff, that maybe some old ways of doing business will go away. But at the same time, there is still something to be said for, being in the store, touching whatever it is you're going to buy, trying it on, whatever that is. And I doubt that that's going to go away. But hopefully some of these landlords will get a little more practical for small business owners so that your lease alone, isn't a potential bankruptcy for you if you have to personally guarantee it and your business fails.
Now, there's definitely going to be a lot of eyes open to the opportunity of being able to work from home and take meetings from home and things like that. But as far as kind of self-employed person or business, do you deal with many self-employed people? And if so, what kind of issues do they have with their business?
Well, so I deal with them all the time. Um, typically what happens to a small business owner kind of before this crisis is that a small business owner has access to significantly more debt than a consumer does typically. And I remember just a few years back, I was hearing some political rhetoric about how small businesses didn't have access to debt, and based on my experience, that was just not true. Right? That these folks have lots of access to debt, and I think the biggest kind of sin that I see small business owners make is they're not very good accountants, and kind of relating back to what we said about the emotional side of the business. They're not looking at the numbers, and they're not adjusting on the fly as they have good periods of business and bad periods of business. And so what happens is you end up using debt to finance your bad periods, and your good periods, you don't necessarily, you can't pay it, or you decide to take your vacation, which you work so hard for, and all that stuff. And so what happens over time for a small business owner is debt piles up. And eventually, because if you're not really disciplined about it, it gets to a point where you can't pay it anymore. And I think that those are the kinds of businesses, they're all sorts of businesses, right? Restaurants, construction, the contractors, the subcontractors, all kinds of service providers are in this boat. And I expect what we'll see, and what we are seeing, is that those that were already kind of in that position are going to be the first ones to call us and to say, hey, we need help. And, for them, there is relief. And the whole name of the game is whether you can keep operating your business or not, through your debt relief. Because while we can often get you out of the debt, we can't necessarily, bend the demand curve for your business back up, right? So, but anyways, those businesses will be the first. And then I think what's going to happen is this crisis is going to push people who are otherwise maybe a bit better positioned as a small business owner, push them to take on debt to try to survive. And that's where I think the SBA loan program is something that's probably the best place to look, right? Because if there's a potential to get debt that ultimately is forgiven, it really doesn't get any better than that in terms of debt options for small business owners. But those people, whether they survive or whether they ultimately need to come see us will depend on how disciplined they are in cutting expenses and minimizing the debt that they have to take. And then, of course, how fast this demand curve comes back for people, right? Because without it, the losses and the small business owner bankruptcies are just going to pile up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we've talked a lot about the problems, or at least some of the problems. There's going to be a lot more that goes into this. But, what are some of the solutions that are available through bankruptcy for these businesses?
Right. So, first of all, there are ways to deal with debt that are not in bankruptcy. Oftentimes, outside of bankruptcy, people can settle debt for half of what they owe, and I suspect that as a wave of defaults hits the economy, creditors will get more and more cash hungry, and therefore your ability to settle debt outside of bankruptcy will be, instead of having to pay half, it'll probably be less in the coming months and years. So bankruptcy is one tool in the toolbox, but it's not the only tool. And people are able to, small business owners are able to negotiate their way, which is why I said at the start, if you're in a relatively, I want to keep my business going and it's not that bad right yet, I think that's where communicating with creditors and, cutting expenses and doing all those things to try to minimize the impact here is in your best interest. If you reach a point or you're at a point where you cannot pay the debt and you just know it, what's happening for a small business owner is they have a corporation, an LLC, and unfortunately, they have guaranteed personal debt. Right? That's the kicker that really makes it hard on an entrepreneur. Right? Is it's that lease that you guaranteed, or the SBA loan that has a lien on your home, which they often do. It's those debts that mean that you're in a situation where not only is your corporation in debt, possibly insolvent, possibly going out of business, but as that happens, your personal financial situation is on the line. And so for those people, there's a couple of key considerations. Number one is bankruptcy for a corporation is very limited. There is a bankruptcy can essentially file a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which is just a liquidation. It only really makes sense if you got assets that creditors are fighting over and you don't know how to manage it. You can kind of throw it into a bankruptcy and let a trustee sort it out. But there's no business that comes out of a Chapter 7 liquidation. That's just basically a way to end a business. And then there's Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which is essentially a forum to negotiate with creditors. And the primary power that a corporation gets in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy is that they can pull certain creditors along if they can get a majority of creditors to agree to a restructuring, right? So if you have a few standouts who are being particularly aggressive, you can kind of force some changes on them. But in those scenarios, in Chapter 11, first of all, it's very complicated. So you're talking about typically tens of thousands of dollars of legal fees. Most small business owners, if you're struggling, don't have that money. And then secondly, there's a lot of risk in Chapter 11. If you can't get the creditors to agree on a restructuring, then the business is going belly up. Financially speaking, a Chapter 11 is only going to succeed if the fundamentals of the business, the cash flow of the business are strong, and the business owners can make a compelling case that it's worth more to everyone to keep this thing going and restructure debt than it would be to kind of fold it in and have a dissolved asset sale. So it's a long way for me to say that a lot of times for a small business owner, your corporation is not filing bankruptcy. Most of the time, it's the owner that is forced into some form of debt relief, either settling business debts or filing for bankruptcy. There are ways, if you just need to shut the business down and you're done. Right now, I'm getting a lot of restaurant owners like this, right? They're the kind of businesses that have piled up debt over the years, and now there's nothing. So they were kind of teetering, and they're out. So they're dissolving, and the owners are looking at a personal bankruptcy to take care of their liability to wipe out their liability for personally guaranteed business debt. So that option is there. For a business owner, especially if you don't have a really asset-intensive business, you can essentially restructure your business into a different entity or as a sole proprietor and file personal bankruptcy and basically leave the corporate debt behind. So we do that for a lot of people. So basically, corporate bankruptcy is usually not great. And so for the small business owner, it tends to be a personal bankruptcy if that's where you have to be, if that's where you have to go. But it is possible in personal bankruptcy to keep corporate assets, potentially, depending on how much they're worth, and continue to run the business, albeit in a different form, a different structure.
Yeah, and at what point do they get when you've personally backed these loans? Does that mean trying to keep the business alive by getting into your savings account, your retirement accounts? Is that advisable, or are you able to step in before, or do you advise people not to do that?
The answer depends on the situation of the business. But usually people are only coming to see me if things are bad. Even then, though, I see and I know from firsthand experience that it's hard to let your dream go. And so, for people where I feel like, hey, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking this business isn't going to make it, and these people really need to get aggressive about debt relief. But I could tell that they're not ready to do that. What I encourage people to do is say, hey, write a 6-month plan, write a 12-month plan, but at some point you got to stop taking your personal assets and pouring them into this hole. So if give yourself some some goals here, and if you don't hit them in 6 or 12 months or whatever is appropriate for you, it's time to be done. And then if that's the case, it's important for people to understand, like a retirement account, for example, is a protected asset in a bankruptcy, right? So if you're liquidating it to pay corporate debt, you're basically giving these creditors something that they otherwise can't get. And so, again, I recognize that if your goal is to make your business work, you're willing to take some of that risk. And, look, that every small business owner is a risk taker at some level, right? And it's okay to do that. It's actually good. It pays off for some people, handsomely. But what I'm saying is, if your business is approaching the crossroads where it's not working, that's when you really have to start looking critically at those decisions. And what we try to do with people is say, look, your retirement account, for example, is a protected asset. You've got this much in home equity. That might be protected. In Colorado, you could protect essentially $75,000 of home equity. There are business assets. There's a tools of the trade protection in bankruptcy that in Colorado is $30,000. So there might be ways to say, look, we can protect this stuff and potentially even keep you in business. Or maybe not. It depends. There certain debts are going to cripple the business, like a retail lease, for example. If you can't get out of that, it's hard to survive without your retail space. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is set a roadmap for them to say, you want to keep going, but maybe stop taking money out of your retirement, or think about restructuring things just in case it doesn't work. Then you're going to be well positioned to get out of the debt for as cheap as possible, which is really what we do, right? Like it's all about helping people get out of debt as cheaply as possible, of course, within the parameters of the law.
Right. And of course, there's that emotional aspect. Again, people want to try and hold on to their baby, like you said, and make it work. But, you've got to reach out to somebody that is outside the business, and, especially an expert like yourself that can, really advise them on what best to do so they don't, pull themselves personally down with the business.
Right.
Mike, give me an example of somebody that you've worked with, somebody that just kind of stood out in your mind. What kind of situation were they in? What were you able to come in and help them with? And, really, what did it mean to them and their lives going forward? Sure.
Some of the best cases came out of the recession, because there's a number of contractors that I represented, during that time, and we kept them in business. They kept their assets. Again, they weren't like gigantic contractors with millions of dollars of assets, but more like with tens of thousands of dollars of assets. And what happened in Colorado for them, it was that by filing bankruptcy kept them in business. It got rid of the debt that they couldn't pay. And then what happened was the market got a lot better in Colorado for what they do. Right? There's basically been a real estate boom in Colorado, going on for a good 7-8 years. I'm not sure what it's like where you are, but I mean it's remarkable. There are cranes everywhere. Now I think that's going to slow down, but it's really been crazy. So for those business owners, and there's 2 or 3 of them that are right at the top of my mind. It was really gratifying to see them from 2010 or 2011 or 2012. And a number of those cases, I had them in a Chapter 13, so I was working with them for 5 years as they kind of went through a payment plan and bankruptcy. And as I saw them come out of that, and just how much better they were doing, while still basically operating their business, that's the best possible outcome for people. And I expect we're going to see that in this crisis too, right? As you'll get relief as we go through it. And if you can kind of stay alive with your business, you'll be able to capitalize on the next wave.
Mm. Yep. Well, staying alive in business, like you said, is really important because they're employing people, they're putting people to work, they're putting food on the table. So it is really important to get the help that you need in order for you to stay afloat during these challenging times. Mike, if people want to reach out to you in the Denver, Colorado area, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. They can contact us through our website, which is just winkandwink.com. That's WINKANDWINK.com. We also have an 800 number that's easy to remember, and that is 888-NOW-WINK. So 888, that is 888-NOW-WINK. That's 524. Actually, that's not what it is, but it's 888-NOW-WINK. I'm not going to try to here's those numbers for you.
I'm on your website here. It's 888-669-9465. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thank you.
All right, great stuff. Well, Mike, I appreciate the time that you spent with me today. I know our audience is going to have a lot of questions that need to be answered. So make sure you reach out to Mike here at winkandwink.com. And Mike, thanks very much for being my guest on the Trust Factor Radio today.
Thank you, Neil. I appreciate you having me.
And to our listening audience, if you like what you hear, hit that like button and share, and we'll see you next time on the show.
You've been listening to the Trust Factor Radio with Neil Howe. To learn about the resources mentioned in the show and to listen to past episodes, go to thetrustfactorradio.com. To get a copy of the book, The Trust Factor, go to thetrustfactorbook.com. If you are ready to act now and build your authority, credibility, and trust, schedule a consultation with Neil at theauthorityarchitect.com.